When link summoning was first announced, my biggest issues weren't with the mechanic itself, but rather how bad the link monsters were. I mean, honestly, if you look at the link monster starter deck, holy crap, those cards are terrible. Decode Talker, if it was an Exceed monster or a Synchro monster, you never would have wanted to make that card. It's not very good, and it was the best link monster in that starter deck. It was way better than Link Spider, and it was way better than Honeybot, but that doesn't necessarily make it good. It's just good because it has no other competition. When we eventually got Code of the Duelist, yeah, there was some pretty crazy link monsters in there eventually, like Firewall Dragon, which didn't see a lot of play right when Code of the Duelist hit, but eventually saw play in the next set in Spirals. Those types of cards didn't really make a huge impact until later on. Pretty much after the starter deck and Code of the Duelist, the only generic link monster that people were really playing in a whole bunch of different decks was Mrs. Radiant, and I don't mean to laugh at Mrs. Radiant, but looking back on it, it's pretty crazy that that was the most popular link monster, only because that card isn't that great. I mean, its effect is basically just half of an Axe of Despair for all of your Earth monsters. Yeah, it's cool that it adds a card back when it goes to the grave, but in general, the reason that Mrs. Radiant was played and the reason that most link monsters were played was only because of their link arrows. So Mrs. Radiant was a card that was very easy to make and had very good arrows, which meant that it was pretty much just always going to be the most played link monster until Konami actually started printing good link monsters. And you know what? Eventually they did start printing good link monsters, and I think if they had made good link monsters out of the gate, people would have actually been a lot happier with the summoning mechanic. But the problem is that it forced people not only to change their decks to accommodate for link summoning, but they also had to play monsters that they wouldn't have played otherwise. Why I think link summoning right now is in a pretty good spot, especially in relation to the Knightmare cards, is that Konami is finally starting to print generic link monsters that people want to play, and that's a big deal. And with Knightmares in particular is really interesting because many of them actually have horrible link arrows, but their effects are good enough that people are using them to actually break boards, and I think that's really cool. So let's talk about that. Why does everyone play Knightmares? We're going to go through each of them. Well, I shouldn't say each of them because we're actually only talking about 4 of the 7. I'm not too concerned in this video with Ibly, Griffin, or Mermaid. It's not that I don't like these cards, it's not that I think these cards are bad, it's just that these cards in the Knightmare sort of context are only really used for extra linking the opponent, and in this video I'm not talking about that. I realize extra linking does happen. It doesn't really happen maybe as often as you might think it does if you don't play competitively, but these cards are pretty much only used for that, and that's just not why Knightmares are so interesting to me. So what we're going to be focusing on is the other 4, which is Phoenix, Cerberus, Goblin, and Unicorn, because these cards all share very similar roles for an extra deck. They're all just utility cards to take out whatever your opponent's cards are or to extend your plays in the form of Goblin. So let's go through those 4 and talk about what makes them so darn good in comparison to many of the early link monsters. The first one that I want to talk about is Knightmare Phoenix because it's by far the best of all the Knightmare cards. It's the one that's played in the biggest variety of decks, and it's pretty straightforward, but it's actually an exceptionally well-positioned card in the modern format. So all of these Knightmares take monsters with different names to make them. So they're pretty generic, but you do have to have, in the case of Knightmare Phoenix, you have to have 2 different monsters. In the case of Unicorn, you have to have 2+ different monsters. So that's 2 or 3, something along those lines. But let's look at Knightmare Phoenix. So it takes 2 monsters with different names. It has 1900 attack points. The arrows are, I mean, they're pretty terrible. They're okay for extra linking. That's kind of what they're designed to do. But really, you're just making this card because its effect is good and because you can use it to link climb up to better link monsters. But this is an excellent stepping stone. So all these Knightmares have effects when they're summoned, when they're link summoned, that let you discard a card to do something, and then if they're co-linked, you get to draw a card as well. But many of the times that Knightmare Phoenix is being summoned in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, it isn't actually co-linked. So when this card is link summoned, a lot of the times what you can do is discard a card to blow up a spell or trap card that your opponent controls. Now that might not sound that good, but if you compare it to Exceed summoning and kind of Synchro summoning, it took a while to actually get these types of cards. I think of Exceed Summoning, it wasn't really until Diamond Direwolf that we got really good back row destruction, and even then, Diamond Direwolf had to blow itself up. Nowadays, we have Tornado Dragon, but think about how long it took to actually get a generic rank 4 monster that took apart back row. And yeah, you do have to discard for Phoenix, but in a lot of decks that doesn't matter, and in some decks that actually helps push your strategy forward. So Knightmare Phoenix is basically the Link version of Tornado Dragon, and I like it a lot for that reason. Now, all these monsters also have sort of these co-linked bonus effects. In the case of Knightmare Phoenix, co-linked monsters you control cannot be destroyed by battle. Now, does that come up very often? It might come up more often in the aggressive decks that are summoning a lot of Nightmare monsters, but in my purposes, in the cases that I've been playing Knightmare Phoenix, that doesn't really come up very often. Really, you're just summoning this thing to get 2 monsters in the graveyard. Maybe they have a graveyard effect. Maybe like you're playing Altergeist or Gokis, they have an effect in the graveyard that you want to activate. Summoning Phoenix is a great way to do that, but this thing helps a lot of decks push through back row, and they don't have to play Tornado Dragon. Maybe they can't even make Tornado Dragon. They play level 4s, level 3s, level 2s, level 1s, so they can't make a lot of Exceed monsters. Knightmare Phoenix gives pretty much every single deck a generic sort of out to back row, and I think that's awesome. On the other hand, you have Knightmare Cerberus. It has pretty similar link arrows. Instead of a right one, it has a left one, but other than that, this card is pretty much the exact opposite of Phoenix. Instead of destroying back row, it destroys a special summon monster in your opponent's main monster zone, and that comes up a lot. I think that effect is super unique. It's not just the catch-all monster destruction effect or monster removal effect like Castell or even Diamond Direwolf, but definitely hits a lot of things. You don't have to hit just main deck monsters. You can actually hit extra deck monsters as long as they're not in the extra monster zone, and this card is really cool. It's a really simple piece of monster removal. Its bonus sort of co-linked effect is that co-link monsters you control cannot be destroyed by card effects. That's pretty neat, and I think it really does help in those extra link scenarios. I know I'm not really going to talk about those that much, but it does help in those scenarios keep your board from being destroyed by Regeki. But this card's really cool. So on one hand, you have Phoenix, which destroys back row whenever you need it to. On the other hand, you have Cerberus, which can destroy a ton of different special summon monsters, and I think in tandem, these cards give pretty much every deck in the game's existence a lot of different options for dealing with different types of boards, and I think that's exactly what Link monsters needed to do. Instead of making crappy Link monsters with horrible effects but okay arrows, I think what Konami needed to do right from the start, and it's taken them a little while, but what they needed to do was make Link monsters that didn't really care about the arrows, but actually just had interesting and dynamic effects so that a lot of different decks could play them, and that's pretty much what Knightmare Phoenix and Knightmare Cerberus do. But we can go even further than that and look at Knightmare Goblin. This card, instead of destroying cards, is pretty much just a Gem Knight Seraphonite, and that's awesome. You guys know I love Brilliant Fusion, you know I love Gem Knight Seraphonite. Knightmare Goblin basically does the same thing. It gives you that additional normal summon, and you don't even have to play Garnets, and it's not as good as a starter card as Brilliant Fusion because you have to actually get to 2 monsters on the board already. But this type of effect is really cool, and the decks that don't want to play Brilliant Fusion but can sort of put out a couple monsters or can make use of some clever tokens can play Knightmare Goblin, and that's awesome. The bonus effect when this card is for co-linked monsters, these cards don't have to be co-linked themselves to get these bonus effects at their last text. They just have to apply to other co-linked monsters, including themselves if that is part of the criteria. But the Knightmare Goblin effect is that neither player can target co-linked monsters you control with card effects. Is that always going to come up? Not necessarily, but the fact that it has that bonus effect on top of the already good extra normal summon or set effect makes Goblin a pretty interesting choice for a lot of combo decks, and it's a really popular choice in the Goki and Spiral list. It's actually one of the most important cards for actually getting that extra link. Otherwise, they would need the use of cards like Double Summon, of cards like Gem Knight Seraphonite, but now they can actually just play one card in the extra deck that gets them to that extra summon to help them make a crazy board. But even for decks that aren't extra linking, Knightmare Goblin is just like an extra copy or a different copy of Gem Knight Seraphonite if you don't want to play Brilliant Fusion, and I think that's what sort of Link monsters needed. These decks that have trouble with their normal summons can now use Knightmare Goblin to get the extra summon, and in some cases, not only can they discard a card to get that normal summon, they can actually draw a card as well, which makes this card really unique and also really good for a Link 2 monster. The last card that I want to talk about is a Link 3 3 monster, not a Link 2 monster like the other 3 we've talked about, and that's Knightmare Unicorn. So this card's effect, and once again, the arrows in this are better than the last 3 we've talked about, but they're not fantastic, but at least it has a down pointing arrow, which is a lot of the times what you want out of a Link monster. But this card's effect is sort of an all-purpose effect. So this one lets you target a card on the field after discarding, and then you return it to the deck. And that's extremely interesting because not only can you target your opponent's cards, you can target your cards as well. And even though that might not come up that often, it definitely does come up. I think one of the most important examples of this effect actually working on your own cards is in the Spiral deck. You can shuffle back your field spell, your 1 copy of it, to make sure that you can search it with the Master Plan. That comes up more often than you might think if you haven't played against that deck or played that deck. But overall, Knightmare Unicorn is just sort of the best attributes of all these other Knightmare cards because it's really easy to make. It just takes 2+ monsters with different names, and a lot of the times you're actually going from Knightmare Phoenix or Knightmare Cerberus, popping an opponent's card, and then going into Unicorn to get rid of another card. But this is basically, I mean, it's a little harder to make, but this is essentially a Castel, but in the form of a Link monster. And yeah, it takes 1 more monster to make than a Castel would normally make, and yeah, you have to discard, but man, this is like the Knightmare monster that I found myself making almost as much as Knightmare Phoenix. Maybe not as much, but I would say like more than half the time that I'm making a Knightmare Phoenix to take out my opponent's back row, and then immediately following that up with a Knightmare Unicorn to take out one of their monsters or to take out a back row and shuffle it back into the deck. It's super solid, and its bonus effect is probably the least useful of any of these cards. Basically, you just get an extra draw during the draw phase if you have some co-linked guys. That doesn't really come up too often. This card's mainly just used as an all-purpose removal card, and in that role, there's like no better card in the Link summoning mechanic to actually do what Knightmare Unicorn does. And pretty much for all of these, that's the case. There isn't really another Link monster that gets you an extra normal summon like Goblin. There's not another Link monster that destroys back row like Phoenix, or monsters like Cerberus. That's why these cards are popping up all over the place. And one thing that I want to mention before I end this video is that these cards, I mean, not so much with Unicorn, but in the case of Phoenix, Cerberus, and Goblin, these are super cheap. I mean, they are really easy to get. Phoenix in particular and Cerberus are just super rares, less than $1, and you can pretty much pull these cards extremely easily, especially if you just buy a couple packs of Flames of Destruction, I believe they came out in, and that makes these cards really budget friendly, and that's exactly what Link monsters needed. You don't have to pay the big bucks to get good Link monsters. Anyone starting out in the game, you can just hand them a couple Knightmare cards that you have lying around your binder, and suddenly they have versatile Link monsters that not only teach them how to Link summon, but also are good enough to be played in competitive strategies. Anyway though, that is going to wrap up my discussion on the Knightmare monsters. Look out for the Link monsters 1 year in review video. That'll be out in a couple weeks now that we are really close to that 1 year mark. It's actually pretty insane. This year has kind of flown by. I know I complained about Link monsters a lot when they first came out, but I actually think they turned out pretty darn good, but I'll talk about that more in that video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys later. Bye.